Hello and welcome to the workshop. In this disc, we're going to be discussing everything that you need to know to work with audio inside both ProShow Gold and, to a limited extent, ProShow Producer. Keep in mind that the tools we cover in this workshop will be available in both Gold and Producer, so it's equally relevant no matter which program you currently see displayed on the screen. For our first chapter, we're going to talk about some things that you need to consider when you begin working with audio before you actually import any piece of music into your show. And that is planning your soundtrack, coming up with exactly what you're going to do before you begin making the audio. Now, a good first step is to have a show intact. So I'm going to bring some images from our sample folder here in Chapter 1 into my show to create a 55-slide show. And as you can see, it's about 5 minutes and 30 seconds long, based on the time indicated here in my information bar in the top right end of the screen. Notice that I currently have no audio tracks. Now, the reason you want to create a show before you begin doing anything else when it comes to working with audio is twofold. Number one, you want to be able to plan your audio for your show so that you can have appropriate audio at any given point in your show to make sure that it matches up exactly. You can think of your role as an audio designer not unlike that of a film composer. Most film composers work with the film playing in the background while they compose the music to ensure that it's thematically appropriate and it matches the scenes that they're creating music for. To do the same thing, you need to have your scenes established. So I always recommend that you make the show first and focus on the audio as one of the final closing pieces of any show that you put together. Now, that isn't to say that the audio will have some kind of influence on what you see, simply that it's best to make those adjustments once the rest of the show is complete. So, for example, here I'm going to reduce the time of my individual slides to about 1.5 seconds, and I'm going to reduce all of my transition times to about 1 second. Doing this, I've dramatically reduced the length of my show down to 2 minutes and 17 seconds. And then, by going to the audio folder in my planning soundtrack chapter, I can see that I have audio tracks available here to use. If I drag and add this into my show, it becomes a complement to the music that's already in place. Notice here that the length of this track is reflected as a waveform that appears beneath my slides. And I can see that the track is about 1 minute 51 seconds long, while my show still is about 2 minutes 17 seconds. But this is closer in length than what I had when I was working with my previous length of show. And of course, the nice thing is, once you get your visuals finished and you get your audio in place, you can begin making adjustments in real time so that we can hear the music that's currently being played. And from there, we can make adjustments to our visuals to better match that music. And that's the intent of this entire disc, is to instruct you on how to adjust and work with your audio so that you can make it complement your visuals as best as possible and make a much stronger whole show. Now, as a brief note before we move on to Chapter 2, keep in mind the copyright of your music. Music that's copyrighted may not give you the rights to redistribute it, especially if you intend to sell your show. It's best that you make sure you have the distribution and especially sales rights for any music that you include in your show. Keep in mind that music like what we've included here, which can be found in our ProShow Media Source packages, is royalty-free, which means that you can distribute it and sell it with no other licensing requirements attached to it. Major songs that you may pull from CDs, iTunes, or other services typically don't give you the rights to distribute or sell the audio. So make sure that you have the legal right to do so before you distribute your show. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2 and talk a little bit about how you actually bring audio into your show and what kinds of audio you can work with. Here in Chapter 2, let's discuss exactly what kinds of audio you can include as part of your show. Now, by default, ProShow supports a wide range of digital audio formats. Here we can see that we have 2 files, both of which are MP3 format. You can verify this by looking at the status bar at the very bottom of the main workspace, which displays information about the file you currently have selected. Here we can see that the extension for this file is MP3, and a breakdown of the exact file type is MP3 audio on the far left. Now, MP3 is the most ubiquitous of digital audio formats available on the market these days. That's what you'll most commonly find on your iPods, on any kind of digital music download service, or other things like that. Obviously, this is the most common and easily supported file type in ProShow. We also have support for a wide range of additional file formats, things that you may never have heard of. We support file formats like OGG or Ogg Vorbis. We support Windows Media Audio files. We even support some less common audio formats that are very uncommon. That said, let's talk a bit about how you actually bring audio into your show and how it works as part of your visuals. I'm going to take a small sampling of images here, and with these images selected, I'll drag them into my slide list to create a brief set of visuals. And here we can see that the slide list is now populated with images. To bring audio into the show, I first need to locate a folder that contains audio. In this case, I can find this folder associated with my Chapter 2 section in my media source entries. To add an audio file into the show, you select it from your file list, just as you would with an image, and then simply drag and drop it into the soundtrack bar that appears beneath your images. Once the audio is added into the show, you can see the waveform reflected in the soundtrack bar underneath your slide list. The waveform is a visual indicator of music playback, and it lets you know that audio is currently set to accompany your show. Once you've dropped your audio into the soundtrack bar, it's available to begin playing immediately, so that if I play back the show, you can hear the audio playing as part of the preview, so that once the audio is added into place, you can immediately begin working with it as part of your overall slide presentation. This helps you work both audibly and visually, so that you can adjust and tune exactly how you want your show to sound. There are also some additional ways that you can bring audio into your show. For example, if you'd like to bring music from a sound CD, that is, any particular album that you may have in your disc collection, you can do so using tools built right into ProShow. If you select Audio from the menu bar at the top of the screen, you'll notice that you have an option here to save music from CD. When you select this option, it opens the Save Audio Track dialog window. Here you're able to choose the CD drive that contains your music CD. You can also enable whether you want ProShow to go out to the internet and find artist and track information for your CD automatically. If you have an audio CD inserted into your PC, you will see a list of available audio tracks displayed here. Select each track that you want to import by clicking on it. Determine whether or not you want those tracks to be added into your show's soundtrack once they're brought into your computer. And finally, choose the digital format that you want ProShow to use. You can choose between Ogg Vorbis or MP3. Once complete, click on Save Track, and ProShow will automatically copy the music from that disc, convert it into a digital audio format, and then, if you've selected the option, automatically add it into your show. So not only can you bring digital music that you may already have on your computer into the show, but you also have the freedom to bring in any music CDs and include those as well. A final note about music files comes in the form of DRM. DRM stands for Digital Rights Management, and it's found in quite a few songs that you may get from services. iTunes is one of the most well-known for including this kind of software. DRM protects music from being used in ways that it was not originally sold for. This usually includes adding music into programs or making unlicensed copies of it. If your music contains DRM, it will not work in ProShow. If you attempt to add that file into ProShow using the same drag and drop method that I used a moment ago, ProShow will simply tell you that it's not a valid file. This is usually a sign that DRM is in place on that music. If that's the case, your best bet is to find another track to use, or perhaps rely on royalty-free music, as you see here and as you find in our media source packages. Now, moving on to Chapter 3, we're going to look at how you actually access and work with the controls available to adjust and determine. Now we begin to reach the meat and potatoes of the workshop here in Chapter 3. We're going to show you exactly how to work with the audio controls that allow you to adjust and determine how the audio is going to behave and what kinds of values you can change for each soundtrack that you bring into your show. To begin, we'll do the same thing as we always do. Start with a selection of images that we can use as part of a demonstration show. I've added 18 images here, very simply to give me an idea of what a basic show would look like before I add audio into it. Now, as a brief recap of what we covered in Chapter 2, here in my audio section, I can now bring in music that I can use as part of my show. Remember that you select it in your file list, just like you would with any image file, and then simply drag and drop it onto the soundtrack bar that appears underneath your slide list. The audio is then imported, which you can see reflected in the green wave file here, and then can immediately be played back as part of your show. Now, with that said, we have a wide array of tools that are available to help you control exactly how your audio is going to work. Let's start by looking at the soundtrack options, which are all of the broad options that control exactly what your music is going to do. These can be found by clicking on the Options icon in the toolbar at the top of your main workspace. Clicking on Options takes me into the Show options, where I can control all of the broad options in my show. In this case, I'm specifically interested in the music category, which will take me to the Show Soundtrack tab. Let's do a brief overview of the options that appear here to get a good sense of exactly what we can control and adjust when it comes to our audio. First and most importantly is the Master Volume. Master Volume controls the overall volume output level of every piece of audio in your show. Those are both soundtracks and any sound effects that you include as part of your show. This slider can be dramatically increased or decreased to reflect the volume level that you prefer in your show. Just beneath the Master Volume, we have the Defaults for Other Sounds. Defaults for Other Sounds is the volume and fade levels that will be used for anything that is not a soundtrack. That is, a slide sound or a sound effect attached to a specific slide. Here again, you can control the volume of those effects. You can also adjust the fade in or fade out times, and this is how long it takes the song to play at full volume at the start or how long it takes to fade out to no volume at the end. Soundtrack during other sounds is what your soundtrack audio will do when a slide sound begins playing. Notice that by default the volume automatically decreases to 50%. This means that if you have a slide sound, such as a camera shutter, a voiceover, or something like that that plays when you reach a slide, the soundtrack will automatically decrease to half of its volume level while that sound effect is playing. This is to make it easier to hear any sound effects that you may associate with the slide. You can determine exactly how your soundtrack is going to behave when other sounds are playing by adjusting these sliders. The soundtrack tools give you access to various tools that can be used to control and work with your audio. We took a look at Save Music from CD just a moment ago in Chapter 2. Record Slide Timing is an interactive timing tool, and this is something that we'll look at in more detail a bit later on in the workshop. Sync Slide to Audio contains a suite of automatic synchronization tools to sync your visuals and your audio together automatically. This again is something that we'll look in more detail a little bit later. Here in the upper right of the interface we have the soundtrack list. This is just like a layers list or a captions list in that we see a linear list from top to bottom of any audio tracks that have been added into your show. Now there are multiple ways that we can work with tracks here. For example, I showed you how to add tracks to your show by dragging and dropping them into the soundtrack bar. You can also add audio to your show right here in the soundtrack list by clicking on the addition icon. This allows you to choose a sound file from your hard drive or from a media source. I can select Add from Media Source here and then choose All About Audio, which is our current workshop, and select Open. This then allows me to make a selection of exactly what audio I want to work with. So I'll locate the soundtrack that I want to include. Once I've found that, click on Open, and it also now becomes part of my audio. I can remove any track by clicking on the subtraction icon, and I can change the order that they'll be played inside the show by moving them up or down inside my soundtrack list. Finally, we can control the behavior of each individual track in your show in the track section here at the bottom. Select the track that you'd like to adjust, and then notice that you can independently control the volume and fade values of each track. You can also set an offset. This is how long the track is going to wait to begin playing from either the previous track or from the beginning of the show. So if I change this offset value to 5 seconds, notice that in my soundtrack bar that's visible just at the bottom here, the start of the song has been bumped back beyond the first slide because it's waiting 5 seconds from the start of the show. Edit Track, which you see here in the upper right of the track section, allows you to open any configured external audio editor. This will automatically open that file so that you can use any audio tool that you have on your system to work with it. Some common audio tools include things like SoundForge, Goldwave, and others. Finally, Edit Fades and Timing allows you to make specific clips or make adjustments to the audio within ProShow, which is a quick and easy way to make sure that the audio behaves in exactly the way you want it to. This is something that, again, we'll look at in much more detail a bit later. As a final note, we have a feature that's available in version 3 and up to the current 4 called the Audio Timeline. The Audio Timeline is a slightly different view of your slide list that allows you to focus much more on the audio waveform and control how your audio is going to behave. This can be reached by clicking the timeline icon in the toolbar at the top of the main workspace. Notice when selected, the appearance of the slide list changes. The waveform becomes a much more dominant feature on the slide list, and our slides themselves are now thumbnailed based on their length of time rather than one single size regardless of time. The longer a slide is, the wider its thumbnail will be in the timeline. Here you have the ability to control and adjust your audio. You can zoom in on the audio by clicking on the plus icon to give you more precision, or you can also use your mouse wheel to achieve the same effect. Zooming in and out allows you to get very precise and make adjustments to your audio without having to open any particular menu. And we'll look at the timeline in much greater detail as we move through the workshop. So that's a basic glance at the controls that are available for working with your audio. As we move forward, we're going to look at each control set in more detail to determine exactly how your audio can be configured and adjusted to do exactly what you want to do so that it matches your visuals perfectly. Here in Chapter 4, we're going to begin learning how you can edit audio so that it perfectly suits the song or the visuals that you have in mind. Once again, we'll need a brief selection of images that we can use as a demonstration show. So I'll simply select those images from my Chapter 4 section and drop them into my slide list to create a brief demonstration slideshow. With this done, let's move on to the important part, our audio. Now let's select an audio track that should work very well for us here. This will be Foreign Lands and Peoples. And again, as we saw previously, I'll drag and drop this into my soundtrack bar to import the song. Once again, as we've seen previously, the music is now immediately available to work with so that we can begin making adjustments and see it in association with our visuals. This said, let's take a look at exactly how we can adjust and make alterations to this audio to make sure that it suits exactly our needs in the show. To begin, I'm going to show you a shortcut to access your soundtrack options. You can quickly access your soundtrack options by simply double left clicking on the waveform that appears in your soundtrack bar. This done, we go directly into the soundtrack options of your show options section. Now, what we can do to edit the track is twofold. As I mentioned briefly in Chapter 3, we can select Edit Track to open an external editor that then allows us to configure and change the way we want the audio to sound. Now, this is a less desirable option because any changes that you make using an external editor will be permanent. That editor will save those changes to the file so that anything that you do to it sticks with it no matter what else you change. Much more easy to do is to use the Edit Fades and Timing tool, which is built directly into ProShow. This allows you to make changes to the audio that are non-destructive. By non-destructive, this means that it does not change the original source file. You can make as many changes and clips as you'd like, and your original audio will never be altered. To begin making changes to your audio, simply click on Edit Fades and Timing. This opens the Edit Fades and Timing dialog window, which we also refer to as the audio trimmer. Here in the audio trimmer, notice that the waveform is the dominant feature of the interface, and it's broken into blue and red waveform visuals. These visuals are simply reflecting the left and right speaker channels of a stereo audio stream. For the most part, you can consider this one waveform. We simply represent each audio channel just in case you have a specific need to capture one or the other. Now, if we take a look at the legend in the lower right corner, we can see that the yellow area is what will actually be played back. This is the sound that we'll hear when we play the audio. The faded black to yellow indicates fade time, and if we look at the waveform, we can see that there's no current fade time configured for this track. Then we can see the blue and the red for our left and right channels. Now, the audio trimmer allows us to cut clips or remove pieces of the audio that we do not want to hear. Notice that we have a timeline at the bottom of the waveform. This timeline is both your track time and the show time. You'll notice that these two match up exactly right now because the track begins at the very start of our show, so they're synchronized perfectly. 20 seconds of the track is also 20 seconds of the show. Now, You can make adjustments to your audio in two ways. You can use the top flags, which appear as white triangles, to determine when your audio is going to start. The position of your left flag is the starting point of your audio, and the position of your right flag is the ending point. So you can determine exactly where your song is going to start and stop simply by adjusting those flags. And at any time you can play a preview to hear what that's going to sound like. So there we can hear that we start in a slightly different position than the very beginning of the song. You can set these flags by dragging them to the left and right. The yellow area will then indicate what will actually be played. Or you can click anywhere in the waveform to place a marker, which you see there, and then I can move my start playback position to that marker by clicking on the left flag icon. You can do the same thing with the ending position by left-clicking to set a marker and then clicking on the right or ending playback icon. This gives you the ability to choose particular pieces of the audio that you want to include in your show. Now, one of the most useful options for this tool is the ability to remove silence from the beginning and end of your tracks. Many digital audio files have silence that's included at both the beginning and the end to act as a transition into other songs. In many cases, as part of your slideshow, this is undesirable and something that you want to remove. So let's do that now. To begin, I'm going to zoom in on my waveform, and I can do this by dragging the zoom slider to the right. This gives me a much more precise view of my waveform. And here, I'm going to drag to the right by clicking and dragging the waveform to get a more detailed view of the silence that we can see at the beginning of the track. This silence is indicated by a simple flat line. To remove the silence, I can left-click to place a starting point marker, and then click on the Start Playback arrow icon to bring my playback position all the way back to the beginning of the audio. However, notice that I've now omitted the silence. I can go to the end of my track by dragging to the end, and at the end of the track, I'll be able to do the same thing. Here we can see where it goes silent. I can place a marker, click on the end playback icon, and that will then stop the audio before we reach that silent portion at the end. So now I've trimmed it down to just the most meaningful audio all the way through. And then again, to verify that this is something I'm happy with, I can click play to begin playing the audio with the silence removed. If you click on OK to save those changes, the audio will automatically be updated. Again, in a non-destructive fashion, your source file is left perfectly intact. And if I select Done, we can see that the portion of silence that appeared at the beginning of the show is now gone, and we jump straight into the music as we get started. Now, what if you wanted only a particular portion of the song to be included in your show? Let's go back into the soundtrack options by double left-clicking on the waveform, and again select Edit Fades and Timing. And here, I don't want to begin playing the song until I get to the second portion or the conclusion of it. That looks to be about the second portion of it right there, so I'll place a starting point marker and click on the Start Playback Here icon, only to use this second piece of the music. Let me play this back to make sure that it sounds acceptable. That sounds like it should work well. Again, click on OK to make that adjustment, select Done, and our music has been automatically updated to reflect those changes. So thus we've learned the point of the Edit Fades and Timing tool is to give you the ability to use only those sections of audio that you want to work with, only those clips that you want to include in your show, and give you the ability to trim out anything that you don't. Moving on from here, we're going to learn how to use the audio timeline to accomplish the same kinds of things visually, and how to adjust your audio much more quickly while still taking the visuals of your slideshow into account. And now in Chapter 5, we're going to learn how to work with your audio without having to go into any options menu. Using the audio timeline, we can make visual changes to our audio while still looking at our slides and get a very good sense of exactly how the audio is going to behave and when it's going to begin playing. Just as we've done in all our chapters previously, I first need some demonstration images to flesh out a slideshow, so I'll simply select a range of images and drag those into my slide list to get us started. There we have our demonstration visuals. Now I'm going to need to move on to the audio folder to open up some audio options that we have available here. And let's start by choosing a song that we want to include as part of our composition. I'll drag in this track, wait for that to import, and here we can see that we now have some audio in place. This audio track is about 3 minutes long. Now, if I play this back as is, you'll see that we have music that slowly begins playing. Now let's say we have a few particular goals in mind for this music. We want to remove the silence at the beginning of it, perhaps add a slight fade in so that it doesn't abruptly begin playing, and then perhaps we'll shorten the audio track early and add in a second at the end just to give us some more audio variety. We're going to do all of this using the timeline rather than working in any particular options menus. So remember again that you can switch into your timeline view by clicking on the timeline icon here in the toolbar. You can also press Tab on your keyboard as a shortcut. Now remember that you can zoom in and out on the audio timeline by clicking on the plus and minus icons here on the far right side, or you can use your mouse wheel. Now notice that when I mouse over my audio track here in the timeline, I have two tabs that appear at the top and the bottom of the track. The top tab tells me the number that this track is in my show. This is going to be track number 1. And it also tells me the name and file type of the music that I'm working with. The bottom tab tells me that I can hold down Control to edit volume and or fading of my track. And this is where some of the advanced timeline tools begin to be available for you to work with. Now let's start by taking a look at exactly how you can move where the song begins playing. If I hold down Control with my mouse over this track, notice that a yellow border appears around the entirety of the track. This now means that the track is available for me to begin editing. If I simply click anywhere in the track and drag its position, notice that I'm actually moving where it's located inside my show. And you can see that the tooltip reflects that I'm changing the offset by doing so. So if I didn't want my track to begin playing until after the end of the first slide, I can simply hold Control and drag it into place so that you can see where the beginning of it lines up with the end of slide number 1. Now what if I wanted to trim the silence from the beginning of this without going in and using Edit Fades and Timing? Again, using the timeline, I can simply right-click at the beginning of the track and select Start Track Here. Here, in this case, becomes my mouse cursor location. Notice now that the track does not start until after the silence is finished. Once this is done, I can then hold Control and move the position of my audio so that it lines up with the end of slide 1 again. Now, in addition to this, let's say that I wanted to add a fade into this track. I didn't want it to abruptly begin playing. I simply wanted a short fade in the audio. Again, without having to use Edit Fades and Timing, I can hold down Control to bring up the yellow border, and I can control the fade by clicking on either the top or the bottom anchor point here on the left. By adjusting this anchor point to the left or right, notice that I create a triangle. This triangle is a fade, and this will cause the audio to fade in or out as it plays back from the beginning. Release Control when the changes are done, and those will then be saved for you automatically. So I've been able to trim the silence from the beginning of the song, position it exactly where I want it to begin playing, and add a fade to the beginning of the track, all without having to go into any specific menus. Now, let's move down the timeline to the end of our song, and let's say that we want to cut it off a bit and bring another piece of audio into the show. So right about the 1 minute marker, I'm going to right-click and select Stop Track here. That's going to end my audio. With this done, I'm going to add a fade to the end of it so that it fades out slightly. And again, the tooltip will show you the time of your fade. And thus now it ends at 1 minute and it fades out. This gives me the opportunity to bring in another piece of audio. So I'll drag another audio sample into my timeline and drop it. This will then appear imported just after the end of my previous track. I can control this track in much the same way. Again, I can right-click at the beginning of it and select Start Track Here to remove the silence. And then I can adjust it so that it begins at the exact same time my previous track ends. But let's say I wanted to do one better than this. Instead of simply having one end and the other begin, which will sound about like this, which essentially works, but it's not quite as graceful as it could be, being as that I'm making a musical transition right in the middle of my show. What I'd like to do here is create a crossfade. To do this, I'm going to blend these two songs into one another to make a fade. Notice the colors of these audio tracks. Tracks alternate between green and blue based on their order in your show. The first track will always be green, the next track will be blue, the next one will be green, etc. This is to help you visually distinguish where each one of your tracks begin and end. To create a crossfade, I can hold down Control on my second audio track and then add a fade to the beginning of it, just as I did with my previous track. But then I'm going to drag my second track over the top of my first track. And notice what happens here. It becomes a blend of the two colors as they crossfade into one another. This will allow me to make a seamless transition from one piece of audio into the next. This means that you don't have a stop or any kind of an abrupt difference between the two. Tweaking the way these crossfade can be done simply by dragging and adjusting the crossfade amount until you get something that you're happy with. Once you achieve a result that you like, you now have a crossfade in place that you're ready to work with. As a final note, you can control the volume of individual tracks in your show here in the timeline by holding down Control and then clicking on the top or bottom anchor points, and instead of dragging them left and right, drag them up and down. This allows you to control the volume level so that you can change the volume without having to go into any options menus. So remember that the timeline is an incredibly powerful tool that allows you to make all of the changes that you would normally use menus for visually right here while still able to see your slides. You can get immediate feedback and see what kind of an impact those changes are going to have on your show right away. Once you've made those changes in the timeline, remember that you can press Tab or click on the slide list icon here in the toolbar to change back to your normal view, and all of those changes that you made in the timeline are reflected in the waveform here at the bottom. Moving on to Chapter 6, we're going to look at those quick synchronization tools that I pointed out in Chapter 3 and get a sense of exactly how these can help you automatically synchronize your audio to your show. Here in Chapter 6, we're going to take a look at the quick synchronization options that can be used to quickly adjust your audio to match the visuals in your show. Once again, we'll need a series of visuals that we can use. Let's just take the entire folder's worth of images for Chapter 6 here. It's going to be quite a broad selection of images, which again is going to give us a total show time of about 5 minutes and 30 seconds if you leave your slides at their default values of 3 seconds for slide time and 3 seconds for transition. Now with this established, let's bring in our first audio track, and we'll simply go to our audio section and drag and drop that into the soundtrack bar. Once the audio is imported, we now have our music ready to play, and if I play this back from the beginning, we'll be able to hear the music that's associated with it. Now, quick synchronization is designed to allow you to make your visuals and your audio exactly the same length. What we can see here by inspecting the information bar in the top right is that our slide time is 5 minutes and 30 seconds, but our audio time is only 3 minutes and 3 seconds. So if we want our visuals to completely line up with our audio, we're going to need to synchronize the visuals to the audio. Now we have multiple tools to allow you to do this. These can be found in the audio section of the toolbar right here at the top of the display. Notice that we have 3 quick synchronization options. We have Quick Sync Entire Show, Quick Sync Selected Slides, and Quick Sync Selected Slides to Track. Let's start by taking a look at Quick Sync Entire Show. What this is going to do is change the time of every slide in your show so that it matches the length of your audio. When you select Quick Sync Entire Show, the change is applied automatically, and you can see that each one of our slide times and our transition times have been changed equally to reduce the length of the show to the exact length of our audio. Now we can see that the show length is 3 minutes and 3 seconds long, and our audio track is also 3 minutes and 3 seconds long. This was done by removing about 1.7 seconds from our slide time in each slide, and this was also done by removing about 2 seconds from each of our transition times. You can see that that's consistent all the way through the slide list, so that if we reach the end of our slideshow, there we can see that the music lines up perfectly with the end of the show. This also works if you remove sections of the soundtrack. If I switch into timeline mode and I trim the silence from the beginning, start track here, and from the end track here, or stop track here rather, I've now changed the audio. I can then resynchronize it again by selecting audio and then choosing Quick Sync entire show. That will then make the changes necessary to match up with the removal of the silence at both the beginning and the end of my soundtrack. So you can see that these changes are made each time you make adjustments. Keep in mind that if you make changes to your slide timing, this will throw off the synchronization. So if I were to change slide number 2 to 5 seconds, notice now that if I go to the end of my slide list, here we can see that the audio is no longer perfectly synchronized with the end of the show. This is one of the reasons why I recommended highly that you add your audio as one of the final steps of your show creation in Chapter 1. Because any synchronization that you make changes the time of your slides rather than the audio. It doesn't change the audio time because changing the actual time of the audio can result in audio distortion, which means that the song is effectively useless at that point. So changes are made to your actual slide times. Now, I'm going to undo a few steps by selecting Edit and choosing Undo, and each one of these is going to step me back so that I can restore myself to my defaults. And as I do this, there I can see that I'm now back to where I started. I have my audio and my slides back their default 3-second values. So that's a look at exactly how you use Quick Sync entire show. It very simply looks at your entire soundtrack and your entire show and synchronizes the time of your slides so that it matches your soundtrack. Quick Sync selected slides, which is our next option, allows you to synchronize only particular slides rather than the entire thing at once. So let's say that I had 2 slides that required longer slide times. I'm going to increase the time of slide number 3 and slide number 5 to be 10 seconds long. Let's say that this is because there's a particular effect in place or something like that that requires a very specific time. That means that I don't want the time of these 2 slides to change when I synchronize my audio. To do this, I can use the Quick Sync Selected Slides option. What I can do here is press Ctrl+A on the keyboard to select every slide in my slide list, and then hold down Control and click on slide number 5 and slide number 3 to deselect them. Notice that these 2 are no longer selected, but every other slide in my show is. With every other slide selected, I can click on Audio in the menu bar and then choose Quick Sync Selected Slides. Notice that this tells me it's about to adjust the timing for all slides. The 53 slides I've chosen will have their timing changed to remove 160 seconds. If I press yes, the change will be made and my show will be exactly 183 seconds long. If I select yes, the change is now made, and here we can see that at the end of my slideshow, my audio lines up perfectly with the end of my show, but notice that slides number 3 and number 5 have been left with their 10-second times intact. That's because they were not selected when I made that change. So Quick Sync Selected Slides is most valuable when you're attempting to preserve the times of particular slides that may have effects in them that are time sensitive. We have one final option for quick synchronization that allows you to synchronize to individual tracks. To do this, I'm going to drag another audio track into my soundtrack bar. You can see that I've now added that here. So I have 2 tracks in place, just like so. And Quick Sync to Selected Track allows me to choose a range of slides and synchronize those to a particular track in my show. So let's say that I wanted to synchronize the first 20 slides to my first song that's in my show. You can see that right now the first song ends at about slide number 17. So what I can do is click on slide number 20, scroll back to the end of my slide list, hold down Shift and click on slide number 1. This will select all slides in the range from 20 all the way back to 1. And then I can click on Audio and choose Quick Sync Selected Slides to Track. This brings up my audio track list, and notice that I have both tracks available for me to select here. I'm going to choose the first track, which is Scenes from Childhood, and click on Sync. Again, it gives me a brief description of what it's going to do. It says that these 20 slides will have their timing changed to remove 22 seconds from the show. If I select Yes, that change is made. Notice now that if I go to slide number 20, my first audio track is now perfectly synchronized with the end of slide number 20. What this means is that using Quick Sync selected slides to track is best used if you want to actually coordinate certain sections of your show with certain songs. So let's say that you had a wedding show. The wedding show was broken into the actual wedding ceremony, then the family pictures section, and then finally the reception at the end. You would want 3 different pieces of audio for the different moods that are associated with each one of those sections, and you can quickly use Quick Sync selected slides to track to make sure that those 3 audio tracks are synchronized with those 3 individual sections of your slideshow. Now, as a final note, in version 4 we've added the ability to choose exactly how your synchronization is going to take place in detail. By clicking on Audio and then choosing Sync Slides to Audio, this brings up the Synchronize Soundtrack options window. This allows you to control exactly how your auto synchronization is going to take place. First, you can choose which slides are going to be used, all slides in the show or only the slides that you select. You can then tell it whether you want it to adjust slide times and transition times or ignore one or the other. You can also tell it to keep your time proportions the same. You can tell it to make all times the same, regardless of what the proportions may be. And you can also limit your transitions to be 3 seconds or less. Finally, you can choose whether you want to match the total length of your soundtrack, that is, the sum of these 2 audio tracks together, or to match the length of an individual track that you can select. Once those changes have been chosen, click on Sync, and everything is automatically updated for you. So, if one of the 3 Quick Sync options doesn't do exactly what you want for your audio synchronization, you can always use Sync Slides to Audio to make those changes very specific and get exactly the results that you want. In Chapter 7, we're going to use a different set of images. These are all very space themed, and we're going to learn how to work with the Record Slide Timing tool, which allows you to set your slides to a beat. This is most often useful if you're working with music that has a much faster beat than what you might otherwise find in some of the slower tracks that we've worked with at this point. So once again, just as we've done in the past, I'm going to begin by creating a show just by selecting all of the images that appear here in my image repository for Chapter 7. I'll drag these from my file list into my slide list, and this will create a new show for me. Now, I have a sequence of images here that have not yet been set to music. So to begin, I'm going to go to my audio folder, and here I have 1 track to work with, which is a bit faster, a bit higher tempo track than we've seen previously. I'm going to drag and drop this into my soundtrack bar to get us started. Now let's take a listen to what this sounds like just to get us started. Here we can see that the track starts off a bit more simply. And then as we move a bit further into the track, if you take a look at the waveform there on the far right, you see that it's going to pick up a little bit as we move through it. So now you can hear how much more active this particular track is. Because of this, we're going to need a show that's a bit faster to match the same thing that's happening in our audio here. Now, since we're creating a little demonstration show, I'm going to go through all of my slides here and just add some simple random motion. So I'll select slide number 1, scroll to the end of my slide list, and then hold down Shift and select slide number 28. Then I can right-click on the slides, choose Randomize. I'm going to randomize motion effects, and I'll select All Effects. This will then give me a little bit of random motion that takes place in every single one of my slides. So you can see that if I begin playing this back again, we have that little bit of motion in place that'll make things more interesting. And now the goal becomes making our slide transitions a little bit more appropriate for the music that we're currently hearing. Now, these slower and softer transitions look like they work rather well for the start of the music, but as this section begins to pick up, we're going to need something that's a bit faster and a bit more dynamic, and that's where Record Slide Timing becomes incredibly useful. To access record slide timing, you can double-click on the soundtrack bar. This will then open up your soundtrack options, and the record slide timing tool is found here in the lower left under the soundtrack tools section. Clicking on record slide timing opens up the record slide timing tool. Now this tool is designed to allow you to listen to the music and time your beats as the music plays. So what we see here is the currently visible slide and its number in your show. We also then see a timeline for the show, starting at the very beginning at 0 seconds. Underneath this, we have a series of keys, and each key is associated with a transition. This means that as you play back your show, you can press this key to create that kind of transition. Right now we have our mouse button bound to a fade. We have key number 1 on the keyboard also bound to a crossfade, and number 2 is bound to a cut. Now for most shows, I'd recommend that you don't use any more than about 2 different kinds of transitions, as it starts to look fragmented if you do more than that. You can change the transition that's associated with each key by clicking on the transition icon to open the transition chooser. Click on the transition that you want to use, and it will then be associated with that key. So this works by pressing Start, and then the music begins playing. At the point where you think a transition would be good to have, simply press the key associated with the transition you want. If you hold the key down, it makes a longer transition. So alternating between pressing or holding the key creates transitions that you can time to the music. So let's begin and see exactly how this works. There, I've held down 1, moved on to the next slide. Moved on to the next. And the next. And now, I'm using cuts to the beat of the music. And there I reached my last slide, which brings me to the end of the sequence. If I'm happy with those transitions, which you can see indicated by the blue bars, then I click on Apply, and those changes are then made to the show. Click on Close, click on Done, and there we can see that the slide times have been adjusted using those transitions that I chose for each sequence. With this done, let's play the show back and see what this looks like. So you can see that because I've timed my transitions to the music, it's picking up in pace. And because I was able to listen to the beat and time my button presses to create transitions with the beat, I'm able to do a much more effective job of timing my audio exactly to the beat of the music. And this makes for a very effective way to get those faster pieces of music tied to your visuals much more easily. At any time, you can go back in and re-record your slide timing to make changes to it in case you're not happy with what you're working with. And of course, you can always apply the other tools that you have available just to finalize things a little bit. So for example, I can come into my timeline and go to the end of my show at slide number 28, right-click and select Stop Track here, and then add a little bit of a fade at the end so that I have a more graceful end to my music right there at the beginning. So what this allows me to do is quickly set up the synchronization and make everything work just right with my individual transitions, and then still use the same tools that I'm accustomed to working with in my audio so that I can make sure everything sounds refined and well-tended. Moving on to Chapter 8, we're going to learn how to record a voiceover in the program, and then from there, we'll move on to a few closing notes. Here in Chapter 8, we're going to talk about recording voiceovers and how you can make your own narration that you can use as part of your slideshows. This can often be great as an association with something like your own documentary, a family history, or something that just needs a little bit of a personal touch that only you can add with your own voice. Now, I've opened the show that we've included for you in Chapter 8. You can find that by opening the Chapter 8 folder from your workshop installation disk, and this will then allow you to directly access the show that contains what you're about to see here. Now, let's take a look at the show as it currently stands to see how it's similar to what we just created in Chapter 7. We begin with an opening caption, a little bit of motion, and we're using the same music that we worked with in our previous chapter. Now here, we have a section coming up that's absolutely perfect for a voiceover. We have some text displayed on screen, and a voiceover would be an excellent accompaniment for this. And then once the text is finished, we move on to the rest of the show. So let's get that voiceover in place on slide number 5. To add a voiceover, I'm going to double-click on the slide to open the slide options, and I'm going to go to the Sounds category, which will take me to the Sound Effects Options tab. This is where you configure individual sound effects that will appear only on single slides. Now, I referenced this in previous chapters, but remember that at any time you can always add a sound effect or another piece of music to an individual slide rather than to your entire show. And this is done simply by clicking on Browse, then choosing whether you want to add a sound file from your hard drive or from a media source entry, locating that sound effect and associating it with the slide. The other option that you have available here is Record VoiceOver, and this is a tool that automatically allows you to begin recording your voice directly into your computer and then add it to this slide automatically. To begin, I'll click on Record VoiceOver. This brings up the Record Sound dialog window, which then allows me to choose how I want to save this. It's going to save it as an OGG Vorbis file on my hard drive, and then I can choose what sound device I want to use for the recording. With that done, all I have to do is click on Record and begin speaking. Now keep in mind that to use this feature you do need to have a functional microphone installed and ready to go on your PC, as well as choose the correct sound device that is using that microphone. So let's start recording the voiceover that's going to work on this slide. Did you know that every day the Hubble Space Telescope archives 3 to 5 gigabytes of data and delivers between 10 and 15 gigabytes to astronomers all over the world? And there my recording's complete. We can see that the duration is just over 12 seconds, and when I click on Done, my voice recording has been automatically added to the slide. Notice that there are a few options that are available specifically for slide sounds. First, we have Continue. This says continue playback of sound after the slide ends. This is enabled by default, and what this means is that if your sound effect is longer than the slide, it will continue to play that sound effect until it's finished. If you don't want it to do this, simply uncheck the option. You also have the ability to automatically synchronize your slide time to the length of your sound, or you can lock the two together so that they can't change. With that done, my voiceover has now been added to the slide. I can click on OK, and notice that the voiceover or any other slide sound that you use appears as a red waveform mixed in with the rest of your soundtrack. The other indicator that a sound has been attached to the slide is this little speaker icon that appears just here in the lower corner of the slide itself. So with this established, let's go back to the beginning and let's see how this sounds. Did you know that every day the Hubble Space Telescope archives 3 to 5 gigabytes of data and delivers between 10 and 15 gigabytes to astronomers all over the world? Now, there are a few things that I want to point out here. First, you may notice that the volume for the soundtrack automatically decreased when my voiceover started. And if you recall, that option can be found in your soundtrack options during the soundtrack during other sounds area. Notice that it's going to decrease to 50% volume when another sound's playing. If that's not quite enough for you, there are two ways to adjust this. You can either make this change for the entire show by adjusting the slider here, or you can open the options for the slide that has the sound file attached to it, click on Override Soundtrack during this sound, and reduce the volume more. The other thing that might work well here is to increase the slide time to match my voiceover. So I'll click on Sync Slide Time to make sure that that lines up completely. With that done, click on OK, and now things should sound a little bit better. Did you know that every day the Hubble Space Telescope archives 3 to 5 gigabytes of data and delivers between 10 and 15 gigabytes to astronomers all over the world? That seems to work quite a bit better for the overall effect. So there we can see exactly how to add a voiceover to a slide and begin working with it as a natural part of your show. Remember that it works just like any other slide sound effect. It appears as a red waveform underneath the slide, integrated directly into your soundtrack. You can control the volume of your soundtrack using an override, or you can set your own custom settings for your slide sound by increasing the volume, adding or removing fades. You can also use the same Edit Fades and Timing tool on your slide sound, just like you can with any other piece of audio. So if I wanted to edit the fades and timing of my recording and eliminate the silence from the beginning and the end of it, I can do that the very same way that I make adjustments to my audio itself. And there we can see that I reduce the time of it just a little bit by getting rid of the silence. And then I can come back and play this again. You'll hear just that little bit of refinement. Did you know that every day the Hubble Space Telescope archives 3 to 5 gigabytes of data and delivers between 10 and 15 gigabytes to astronomers all over the world? So there you can see that with a little bit of refinement, your basic voiceover, and some competent changes to your audio use, you can get an excellent sounding piece of narration that you can use just about anywhere in your show. Now our final chapter will just tie all of the things together to blend the audio in this show that we're currently working on, finalize things a little bit, and show you exactly what you can do to get a complete piece of audio integrated into your show. For our final chapter, Chapter 9, all we're going to do is make some adjustments to the show that we've already created, starting in Chapter 7 with our record slide timing, refining it a bit in Chapter 8 with the addition of some voiceover narration, and now we're simply going to combine the things that we've learned in this disc thus far together so that we can just edit the audio a little bit, clean everything up, and have a general soundscape that's worthy of a final show. Now to begin, I want to start by making sure that the silence has been removed from my main soundtrack. To do this, I'm going to double-click on my soundtrack bar and then select Edit Fades and Timing. Looking at my soundtrack here, I can see that there doesn't appear to be much silence at the beginning of the track. However, just to be sure, I'm going to zoom in and scroll all the way to the left to double check and make sure there's none there. It doesn't appear that there is. So I'm going to scroll to the end of my track, and there I can see that I've got some silence tapering off at the end. So I'll place a marker and then click on my end playback icon to stop the playback there. With that done, click on OK, and then select Done. Now my volume levels for my voiceover were adjusted pretty well when we got started. One thing that I might adjust just a little bit is I'll push my start of my soundtrack back until a little bit in to slide number 1. To do this, once again, I'm going to go into Timeline View, and at the beginning of my show, I'm going to hold down Control and drag my audio to the right just slightly so that I can get everything adjusted and perhaps add a very slight fade of no more than about 1.5 seconds. So that that lines up nicely. Now, while I'm on this topic, I'm going to move to the end of my show. And here, I want to right-click and select Stop Track here, just to bring the track to an end at the conclusion of my show. And then hold down Control and add a fade out to the audio, so that it has a nice complete effect at the conclusion. Now, with those adjustments made, I'm going to go back into my normal slide list view, and from here let's begin playing things back and see if we like the way this sounds. So we begin with silence for space, and we slowly bring up the audio. This then carries us into our first few slower introductory slides. Did you know that every day the Hubble Space Telescope archives 3 to 5 gigabytes of data and delivers between 10 and 15 gigabytes to astronomers all over the world? So there we can see that we're beginning to get the audio nicely lined up together and well adjusted. So as a summary of what we've learned in this disc, remember that you bring your audio into your show by selecting it just like you would any image file and dragging and dropping it into the soundtrack bar. Once the audio has been imported, you can adjust your soundtrack by double-clicking on the soundtrack bar to bring up your soundtrack options, and using any of the individual tools here to control exactly how your audio is going to behave. Don't forget that you can always bring in music from your own audio CDs for use in your show. Once you have the music added, you can go in and make adjustments to it, or you can use the timeline to control precisely how it's going to behave, create crossfades, and blend your audio nicely together. From there, remember that the Record Slide Timing tool is available here in your soundtrack options to allow you to go in and set any precise timing that you want to take place for faster audio that you may include in your show. And then, don't forget that you have the ability to record voiceovers or attach your own sound effects to individual slides in your show to add a little bit of variety and visual interest to your show. Also keep in mind that one great use for slide sounds comes in the form of ambient sounds. If you have shots of forests or things like that, include some sounds of some insects, perhaps some wind, or if you're taking a shot of a beach, include some sounds of waves crashing. It does a good job of creating an audible landscape that works as an excellent complement to your images and just adds a little bit of an extra touch that might otherwise be absent without it. Thank you very much for watching this workshop disc, and I hope you come back to us for all of the rest of your ProShow training.